Oh, Tom Tugendhat.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted. Not at all, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's always a privilege to speak in any debate chaired by you. I rise to support the motion in the name of the Minister, my right honourable friend, and on the export of items of torture, because this is a subject that you will understand, Mr. Deputy Speaker, has often been very close to my heart. It is one of the inalienable rights that this House has secured in this realm and has influenced around the world, is the absolute right not to be tortured. As the Deputy Speaker, as you will know, there are many rights that we enjoy through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and indeed through laws and custom and practice that this kingdom has established over many generations, but most of them are qualified. When we talk about, for example, the right to life, it is not true that that is an unqualified right. Otherwise, there would be an absolute requirement on every single doctor to provide the most invasive surgery and the most invasive treatment on everybody at every stage in their life. And clearly, that would be wrong. For some people, that would be actually an act of cruelty. And there are many other rights that are qualified in various different ways, including, for example, the right to a family life, which is qualified when people commit such crimes of such gravity that their rights are legally withdrawn from them. But the right not to be tortured is an absolute right. There are no grounds on which torture can be or is indeed ever acceptable. And this is something that our country has recognised now for many, many years. Indeed, for those who have been to the Tower of London, I admit that I haven't been for many, many years myself, but if you remember the signature of that famous traitor, Guy Fawkes, before and after his torture, the first signature in the florid script of a Tudor handwriting, and the second in the scratchy, ink-stained quill all over the parchment, demonstrating the torture and indeed the harm that the rack had caused to that man. But there are, of course, many other occasions where torture has been seen, not just in the UK, but more sadly today and around the world. And we know, sadly, that torture is extremely common. In fact, we are hearing time and again recently of the terrible crimes committed against the Yazidis by the Islamic State. Crimes of torture, if ever there were any. Crimes that really do cry out for justice, as women have been raped, people have been separated from their children, and men have been murdered in the most horrific fashion, and children have been enslaved either to become sex workers or to become murderers on behalf of the Islamic State. So we see today that torture is all too sadly alive and well. And sadly, it's also alive in certain states. And recently this has been brought to my attention, as indeed brought to the House's attention, in the case of Brunei Darussalam. And this is a moment of great sadness to many of us who know that Brunei, Land of Peace, as it calls itself, has been a great friend of the United Kingdom for many years, but today finds itself reintroducing the charge and indeed the penalty under hudud, under the Sharia, of stoning to death for homosexuals. Now if this isn't a form of torture, a form of unbelievably cruel and unusual punishment, I don't know what is. So we know, sir, that today torture is very sadly alive and well, despite the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, despite the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and, of course, the 1984 Convention Against Torture, which has now been signed and ratified by over 150 nations, and so I'm delighted to say now stands part of ordinary laws and part of the common understanding of rights that people enjoy. But as we focus on these particular rights, I think it's very well worth us thinking about why we are now domesticating these rights and not just allowing existing rules to stand. Of course, they don't stand as we step away from the European Union. But it's also worth thinking why it is that these rights were so brought into Europe, because, of course, many of these rights were introduced not by the European Union, but by the European Convention on Human Rights, that amazing piece of drafting, drafted by lawyers in the aftermath of the First World War, Second World War, that paragon of torture, that terrible moment when the world looked the devil in the face and the devil really did take hold. And those laws were drafted really following that absolutely appalling moment by, I'm very pleased to say, very often by Conservative lawyers, in fact by one lawyer who ended up being a Conservative Attorney General, and by people who realised that when the world has turned its face to evil, the only thing that can and only occasionally restrain it is the law. So I'm delighted, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we are finally recognising today, that we are again recognising today that the law requires the ability to control the export of items of torture in order to ensure that we can play our part, not only in... I will give way.
Thank you, Member, for giving way. The Member will, of course, confirm that there is absolutely no suggestion whatsoever that our departure from the EU impinges on any way on our support for the ECHR, for the European Convention of Human Rights. That is something which stands in place and stands alone and is not affected whatsoever by our membership of the EU.
The Honourable Member is absolutely right. The ECHR, as the Honourable Member knows very well, was signed in the 50s, well before the European Union, stands separate from it, and indeed underpins many aspects of the laws that, in fact, have been signed with neighbouring states, as indeed he knows only too well. He will also know, of course, that the ECHR was not so much the import, in fact, not at all the import of European law into the United Kingdom, but the export of UK law onto Europe, as I say, written in the aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War. So it's of great importance that we remember that these are very different things. But as I close, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'll merely say that it is absolutely important that we recognise the export of these items are not only just horrific, but they stand against all the values that this House and these great islands stand for. And so it's with great pleasure that I support my honourable friend, the Minister.
Excellent.